really giving yourself that time to get adequate rest, and then ultimately making the decision intentionally to be like, well, what is the kind of rest state that I want to be in? And allowing yourself to become more than just enough, because that is the transition from surviving to thriving and to blooming and to existing in this holistic space.
Hello, and welcome back to Seek the Joy podcast. Happy Seek the Joy Tuesday. I'm your host, Sydney Weiss, and welcome back to another episode in our Best of Seek the Joy podcast episode celebration as I take a little bit of a pause, a little bit of a break, hit refresh on Seek the Joy and all things Seek the Joy. I'm taking my first ever break from publishing new episodes, and it's interesting. I have a lot of reflections. I'll come back to you with those in a little bit of time. But in the meantime, I'm so excited to share this one with you again. This one with Meghan Watson, registered psychotherapist and the founder and owner of Bloom Psychology and Wellness, a therapy practice based in Toronto. And this episode originally aired in June of this year, of 2021. It left such a beautiful impression on me that even though it wasn't shared that long ago, I just knew we had to share this episode one more time in 2021. Meghan really focuses on education and support in her everyday clinical work for individuals struggling with understanding their emotions, managing stress, and establishing healthy relationships. And she does so through this beautiful, radical self-compassion and body liberation lens. Outside of the therapy room, Meghan is also a writer, consultant, and content creator. And so through all these different avenues, she works closely with organizations and companies in developing holistic, thoughtful mental health projects with an intersectional perspective on mental health. And this episode was so good because it was all about choosing rest and its connection to self-trust and boundaries. And so as I'm taking a little bit of a rest, this just feels so on time. So Meghan and I chat about so much. We dive into why we often struggle with allowing ourselves to rest and practice self-care that serves us, how we can begin to develop greater self-trust and why it's sometimes super difficult to maintain. Meghan shares with us the connection between boundaries and rest and why boundaries are so important, and her top tips for setting good boundaries with yourself, your rest, and your self-care. Plus, Meghan shares how we can continue to nurture ourselves while just maintaining our connections with others and with ourselves, how greater rest leads to greater joy. Spoiler alert, it's so true. Her biggest dream, and so much more. One of the reasons why I do this podcast is because I really want you to be able to live a happier, more joyful, and just ease-filled life. And so that's why I'm so happy to share that today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. The last year and a half, there is no doubt it's been difficult. And that's why I think now more than ever, it's important that we have reliable resources that we can turn to. And that's where BetterHelp comes in. So this is how it works. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist. It's easy and free to change counselors if you don't think the person you're matched with is a good fit. And this service is available for people worldwide too. BetterHelp also offers a broad range of expertise in their counselor network, so you'll get timely and thoughtful responses, and you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions too. So, as a listener of Seek the Joy podcast, you will get 10% off your first month by going to BetterHelp.com/seekthejoy. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/seekthejoy. The link will also be included in our show notes. This episode with Meghan was just one of those where I walked away and I was like, oh my God, I cannot wait to talk to her again. So Meghan, we may have to have another conversation for the podcast in 2022, but of course I can't wait to hear what you think about this one, whether you've listened to it already back in June and you needed a little bit of a refresher, or it's your first time tuning in. I just know you're going to take so much from this because it's November right now and we've had another crazy long year with the pandemic and things returning to normal and not normal and everything else in between. And so I think we all need a little bit of an opportunity to give ourselves this permission to rest and take better care of ourselves. So I know you're going to love this. I'm so excited for you to tune into it again. So without further ado, let's dive in. Meghan Watson on choosing rest and its connection to self-trust and boundaries. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you today because I know recently you posted on your Instagram about your journey with rest and your journey with burnout and taking a step back. And when I read your post, I was twofold. I was really inspired by what you had to say, but I also was like, yes, like somebody is talking about this, talking about, the resistance that we often have towards rest. And for a lot of us, me included, it's not natural. Like I don't gravitate towards moments of like resting. I gravitate towards moments of creating. And so I would think it'd just be really valuable to start off by talking about maybe what inspired those posts that you put up on Instagram. And if you're willing to share, a little bit about your journey with this component of rest and self-care and allowing yourself, to step into that space.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. I'm glad that you mentioned it because I was like, this is so timely because I am kind of taking a little bit of a break from Instagram. But I don't know if people know this about me if you just see me on IG, but I run a full clinical practice. I see sometimes 25 people a week.
Wow.
I run my full-time clinic. I have 6 associates. I have a business to run. And right now my workplace consulting and mental health component of my job is just growing and growing and growing. So I basically have 3 or 4 full-time jobs at this point.
Yeah, you do. You really do.
So Instagram is like one of them. And so what I noticed is when I started my Instagram, I really did it just to be creative. I was transitioning into a season of my life where I wanted to really share some of the ideas that I was thinking about and learning about in a non-traditional way. I saw that there are other therapists out there. I only started that page in September 2019. So it's about a year and a half old.
Wow.
And so I just kind of got excited about sharing ideas, and it's a creative outlet for me. But the moment it started to become a space where it was more work than it was just a creative space where I could, practice graphic design and, play with colors and talk about cool therapy things, is when I started to really develop a different relationship with it. And so that's why this rest period came about. I realized that so much of my life is connected to the social media platform, and my history with taking rest, as you can imagine, having all these different responsibilities is not the greatest. I'm not good at practicing what I preach, and so I really wanted to take the opportunity to do so, and to do so thoughtfully. So stepping back from posting and doing the creative work that I do, which sometimes takes me hours to develop and to formulate, was a moment for me where I definitely had that anxiety of like, oh my God, will people even care about this if I come back in 3 months? But I don't care anymore because it's for me. And so I need to rest in order for me to do the work that I want to do. And so whoever is with me when I come back, then we'll have fun together. And then maybe I'll take more rest. But that's kind of what it's looking like for now.
I think it's so interesting what you said, that this period of rest for you is about so you can, I mean, what I'm gathering from what you're saying is like this period of rest is an opportunity for you to figure out how you can fuel that tank up again so that creating is fun. So it's not like a chore. It's not like a responsibility. It can be fun again for you. And I have found that too, like in moments where I take a step back and I allow myself to rest and not put a lot of pressure on myself, because I think the need for rest often comes from this sense of pressure, like the pressure we put on ourselves, the pressure we experience from others. And so the moment I kind of like let up on that gas pedal a little bit, I start to feel a little bit more excited or invigorated, or like, oh, okay, this is something I want to do. Or this is totally not something I want to do. But unless you give yourself that space, you don't even have the opportunity to figure out like how you want to proceed, like how you want to move forward.
Absolutely. Honestly, I think bringing more intentionality, and not just intentionality is like, well, I intend to do this, but really bringing a thoughtfulness and an integrity to the
Mm-hmm.
decisions that I want to make around my creativity, around my capacity, how much energy I have, and when is something that is really empowering for me. I talk a
Mm-hmm.
lot about boundaries. I talk a lot about finding space and navigating burnout. And the reason I can talk a lot about that is because I experience it. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
human being. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
therapist, but I'm a human being. And I know what it's like to feel like there's just too many things on your plate and they're stacking up and you don't even have time to feel like a real person again. So if I can model as much as possible some of these tools to step back and really reflectively look at what I'm doing and why, and thinking about how that's going to fill up my cup again in whatever way that I choose, I'm hoping to continue to do that.
Mm. I really love what you just said about being intentional and stepping into your own integrity when it comes to rest. And I think we often miss this piece about being intentional. I mean, I don't know about you, but the last year has been like, how do I just survive? How do I often just keep my head above water? So I really wasn't always being intentional about my time. It was like, how can I just, keep myself in a good headspace? And so I'm curious, this piece about being intentional. Do you have any thoughts or insights or ideas that can come from your personal reflection or just in general about why we often struggle with this piece about being intentional about our time or being intentional about our rest? I have some thoughts, but I would love to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts on this. I think one of the major pieces that I notice is that we don't have as much autonomy over how our schedules work.
Mm,
Um, and we haven't really set up a society that allows people to make those decisions for themselves. Whether it is because you're put on shifts that you can't control, whether
mhm.
it's, you have people that are pulling you in different directions because they really need you. You provide a service or you provide a resource that is necessitated
Right.
for, other things to happen and for other things to exist. I think a lot of people's work and life, parenting, relationships, they are dependent on other people. And so our rest becomes dependent on whether or not we have the space and time within those relationships, within those situations, those workplaces, those environments. And oftentimes, when we develop this relationship of dependence and not necessarily listening to our own mind, our own bodies, and really starting to become hypersensitive and aware of what other people need and what they desire, we lose and I call it like our internal wisdom. It's like a body clock of like
Mm,
what it is that you need and when and how. And it's not uncommon for me to connect with people, clients or otherwise, who really have no idea what they need.
mm,
No one has really asked them that question. They haven't thought about it. They haven't even considered that they might be the word that I used to call it emotional martyrs for
Ooh,
other
that's a good
people.
one. Yeah. Yeah.
Martyring yourself for other people's needs often feels selfless. It feels altruistic. It feels motivating because we feel good as human beings to contribute to other people. It's
Hmm.
just the facts. We are connecting. We're social animals. We love to contribute and to be helpful. But that helpfulness and that usefulness can become integrated into who you think you are, as opposed to what it is that you need to
Mm.
survive and to thrive. And clarifying that and bringing some wisdom to not what is it that you can do for other people, but what you can do instead for yourself, and framing that as a requirement for thriving as opposed to an addition
Mhm.
to what you're already doing is really powerful for people. But it takes a lot of work to spot
Mhm.
that dynamic in your life and to ultimately start to build in rituals and routines that allow you to take those moments of reflection and inflection to say, I haven't checked in on my needs globally, or on a micro level or on an interpersonal level. And those rituals of connection, we are very familiar with family. We have family dinners, we have work meetings, we have lots of rituals around connection and checking in, right? Touching base with people. But we don't really develop those rituals of connection with ourselves. And ultimately, that is the tool to be able to figure out when you're burning out, when you need rest, whether you need a glass of water or chapstick or whatever it is that your body is telling you that you need.
Yeah. What you're talking about reminds me, it just feels like being able to tap in and reflect and really look at where you are and what you need. And if you are, giving more of yourself to others than you even are giving to yourself, it just feels like a huge practice in boundaries. And I love what you said, because the truth is listen, a lot of us are not even good with boundaries with other people, let alone with ourselves. So if I can't practice good boundaries with friends or coworkers or family or anybody, it's like, do I really even know how to set those boundaries with myself? I have just found like this exercise, this knowing of what even boundaries are has been a journey. And a lot of us even struggle with like, what are boundaries? So Megan, what are boundaries? And like, why do we need them? Because I think they're huge.
Simplistically, it is the literal and or metaphorical line between you, people, and your environment. That's it.
You, people, and your environment, the line that you choose to draw in that moment.
It is, I think, according to the dictionary definition, it's, a literal line or metaphorical line, or it fixes a limit or an extent. So, we think about that in terms of property. Where does your property line draw out? What's the boundary? What's the limit? What's the extent of that material land that you live on, whether that's your apartment or whether that's your home, your backyard? That's a literal line. But boundaries can be metaphorical. They can be intangible. They can be emotional. They can be spiritual. They can be much more focused on the things that we can't see as much. There are definitely boundaries like property boundaries, material boundaries, even, intellectual property sometimes can be tangible and intangible. But, thinking about all of the different limits we have and the boundaries we have with our world, it makes sense that we're going to need to have a little bit of a policy and an understanding of what that means for us before we interact with our environment.
What I think is so interesting about boundaries too is two things. It goes back to what you were saying. One, we can't be everything for everyone all the time. And I think that includes ourselves. And on the other hand, it can often be really uncomfortable to say no to someone or to disappoint them or feel like we're disappointing someone else. But really, in the process of doing so, we are honoring ourselves in a way that I don't think we're naturally accustomed to, especially I think in Western society. We are so used to saying yes and how can I help you? And I think as women too, we really bend in that direction. So I feel like it's a muscle. I don't know what I'm doing with my hand. I'm like lifting an invisible barbell, but I think it's a muscle that we have to build over time, and saying no, and practicing that and knowing when you're doing so and you're setting that boundary or that line for yourself, you're honoring yourself and what you need in that moment. And you can't always control obviously the way someone else receives it. But at the end of the day, I think honoring yourself should absolutely come first.
I agree with that. And I wanted to touch on a point that you mentioned there about this desire to not disappoint people. And that need to feel like you're doing something good for someone and they're not going to be sad. They're going to be great. You're improving their life better than when you left it. And I think a lot of this comes from intergenerational trauma. Unbeknownst to us, our family structures create a lot of the blueprints to which we have an emotional experience of as an adult. So people pleasing and not wanting to disappoint people can be related to a history of feeling like you needed to manage and to understand your parents or your caregiver's emotional needs in order for your needs to get met. So if mom was not happy and warm and helping you with your homework unless she was feeling good, you are learning from a really early age that you need to attend to her needs so that your needs can get met.
Mm.
And I just use the example with mom, but it can be any caregiver. It can be a sibling. It can be an early relationship. It can be, a caregiver in any capacity. But often we need to understand why and how these things get transmitted to us through our generations, through our lifespan, so that we can start breaking cycles with our own families and ultimately become aware and use that awareness as the conscious foothold into change.
I just want to take a second and sit with what you just said about the blueprint, that our dynamics within our family that cross generations really set up this blueprint, this map of how you navigate the world and how you present yourself in the world. So whether or not you feel you deserve rest, or knowing how you can take rest, or setting up good boundaries for yourself so that you even know when you need to take a time out or have a sip of water or put on chapstick, as you said earlier. I mean, this is so interesting and so valuable, I think, for everyone to know and to talk about this idea of this blueprint. And I think even just having the awareness of it is a game changer. You may not know what to do with it next, but even knowing that it exists, I think it shifts your perspective and maybe even the lens through which you're seeing your experience and how you're interacting both with yourself and then I think with others too.
Yeah. Ditto.
Yeah.
Agree with everything you said.
Yeah. It's interesting. Rest and boundaries for me has also meant learning how I can trust myself and trust my judgment in any given moment. And I feel like that ability to develop trust with yourself is really closely linked to confidence. It's closely linked to self-esteem, this level of awareness and understanding. But often I think we really struggle with trusting ourselves. Like, I know I do it all the time. Like when I second guess myself or a thought or idea, and then I find myself like checking in with everybody in my life. What do you think about this? Like, what should I do? Why is self-trust something that's so hard to develop or even to maintain? Because I think we ebb and flow with it.
I think there's a larger theme in our culture and in our society. And I'm talking about Western culture and Western society here, that we should always be engaging with our world and ourselves with a healthy sense of skepticism and critical nature, critical eye. And I think that skepticism is misconstrued out of the scientific context and can be kind of conflated with like, well, I'm skeptical of whether I can do this, or I'm not sure, or I'm unclear as to my capacity. And, now we're getting into self-efficacy and confidence and belief. But I think there's generally like a larger theme here in which it's valued for us to engage critically with the matter, whether that be things that we're reading, media, engagement. We are often very, very skeptical of what we see, and sometimes for good reason. But I think that sometimes gets conflated onto ourselves. I think self-trust is also incredibly hard because we don't often do the things that we're going to do. And I link this back to boundaries because if you are not able to check in with yourself to be able to gauge what it is that you can and cannot do, you will constantly overschedule and mismanage your time and ultimately create a self-fulfilling prophecy in which you cannot trust that you're going to set up the framework for you to be successful. When I share that with people, especially within the therapeutic relationship, their mind is a little bit blown.
Yeah, I can see it's like that emoji, the emoji where the head's like coming off like with steam.
Right.
Like, whoa. Like you're telling me I'm setting up scenarios essentially where I'm showing to myself time and time again, oh, I can't trust myself to manage myself in my time the way I need to. Yeah, mind blown in that moment, I can imagine.
And I use this because most people are interested in trying to find a way to trust themselves, but they're resistant to becoming mindful in the moment because that awareness and that mindfulness can sometimes feel a little crunchy granola. Not everybody is super into like tapping into that sense of internal wisdom. But two, I think mindfulness, it's almost too simplistic of an answer for a lot of people. They want a complicated way of looking at this. And I usually say, like, let's start with emotional awareness. Let's start with clarifying your values. Let's start with understanding your boundaries, because I can guarantee you that once we start to do that, you will start to feel more in control of your actions, and ultimately all this uncertainty and this anticipatory anxiety and this burnout and this lack of self-trust in your ability and confidence to move forward in your life, it's going to shape, and some of it will disintegrate, some of it will turn into other things. If it's persistent, then we do more analysis and we do a little bit more assessment as to what could be happening, whether that's intergenerationally or otherwise. But yeah, I think self-trust is a confluence of issues. And at the core of it, it has to do with, are you self-aware enough? Are you mindful enough? Are you conscious enough of how you move through the world? And ultimately, can you create a life for yourself within the limitations of your work or your capacity or your ability to be as successful without judging yourself, without shame, without undue and unnecessary criticism or blame as to whether or not you're doing it right.
So really, developing trust, developing confidence within yourself comes back down to self-awareness. I love what you said about being mindful in the moment. And the first thing that popped in my mind when you said that was, oh, we need to slow down. We need to take a step back, because in order to be mindful of yourself in the moment and either what you're doing, how you're responding, how something makes you feel, means you have to slow down enough to actually be able to observe it. I have found in moments when I am super stressed, anxious, buzzing, like Tasmanian devil style, like between things that I need to do, it's because I'm moving too quickly and I don't have that level of self-awareness. I haven't slowed down enough to be able to check in, to be mindful in the moment. I'm curious too, I think there's sort of this, I don't know what the right word is, but I don't know if it's a domino effect or just kind of like it's a never ending circle. Like if you're not taking good care of yourself, then it's really hard to be mindful in the moment. And if you're moving too quickly, it's hard to be mindful in the moment. And so it's hard to maintain this too, I would imagine, if you're just not taking good care of yourself in a way that is nourishing for you and fulfilling for you too.
And I think that difficulty is the hamster wheel that a lot of people get caught
That's
up
the
on.
word, hamster wheel. I was like, what is that? No, it's hamster wheel. You're right. We get caught on it.
It is so hard to get out of it. And I think, it's important to just sit with and validate yourself and say, this is really hard. I'm asking myself to engage in a task that I generally judge myself incredibly harshly for. I don't have a lot of time to check in. I don't feel comfortable in my skin. I don't feel confident or trusting of my ability to do much or most at this point. And, to be perfectly honest with you, I think people are fearful of validating those feelings because then they're real. Yeah. And once those feelings become real, then most people want to do something about it. And ultimately, if you don't have the answers right away, and you are generally a person that is judgmental of yourself, is very harsh and wants yourself to know all of the things and do all of the things, it's going to be really, really hard for you to reach a juncture where you're going to need to ask for support, or you're going to need to slow down enough to think about an answer that's not going to come to you right away. And that's super triggering. And so ultimately, what do we do instead? We avoid. And avoidance looks like overworking. It looks like cognitive avoidance, like just kind of numbing out, whether that's through substances or whether that's through just Netflix or dissociation related to trauma. People have lots of ways of avoiding the difficult things in their life. And which is why therapy is so hard.
Yeah.
Because nobody's more present and aware than your therapist. We're kind of tapped in.
Mm-hmm.
And once we make that observation, it's really hard to escape.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen some creative ways that clients can kind of be like, well, I don't know if I want to talk about this anymore. This is a lot. Anyway, thanks, bestie.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
I think that's such a good point, just about when you actually are in that space of awareness, you have to face it, or you'll find other ways to escape it. But part of that too is like we recognize the things in us that we want to change, or that we feel we want to, work on or have more awareness around. And then on the flip side, I think we also struggle with validating the good things about ourselves, like validating like the way in which we show up for friends or family, or our kindness, our empathy, our compassion. Like we also really struggle with that end of it too. And so if we're not validating ourselves at all across the board, it's like, yeah, we're not being mindful in that moment at all. We're like, how can I continue to avoid this?
Mm-hmm. And that touches on, one of the things I usually direct people to do when they're trying to figure out how to trust themselves again. Honor your talents. What is it that you do well? What are your strengths? I asked that to someone the other day and they were like, I have no idea how to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly don't. I don't know what I'm doing well right now. And I pushed. I said, I know that you don't know how to answer it, but I want you to try. And at the end of that session, they shared with me that no one had ever pushed them to do something that they didn't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that they were glad that I did, because it got them to get out of this way of trying to control the situation, even in therapy, trying to control the way that they heal,
Mm-hmm.
And into a very naturalistic way of showing up authentically and honestly. And those moments are so rewarding, because as you hear someone describe all of their strengths and what they do well and their talents, you start to really see that they do trust themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that self-trust is not just linked to mindfulness, but it's also linked to self-perception.
Mm-hmm.
And it's linked to our ability to look at another way of seeing the world, in a way that is more kind, a way that is more open, a way that is a little bit more connected to ourselves as whole beings, as opposed to workhorses or constantly needing to be an optimized version of ourselves.
What you just said really brought up an interesting memory for me. So I want to share it with everybody that's listening. A couple of years ago, I think it might have been, maybe 4 years ago, I was in this big job search trying to figure out what I was going to do after law school. And this woman who was helping me, and she said, just make a list of like 20 things that you're really good at, that you excel at, that you feel good about. And I was like, okay. And I went home and I sat at this, like stared at this blank Word document. And I literally remember putting my hands on my head and being like, I have no freaking clue. And I sat with that feeling. And what it brought up in me was this sense of, is it okay for me to acknowledge all the good things about me? Is it okay for me to acknowledge all the things, that I feel like I'm good at? And then it brought up this sense of like, do I have the permission? Do I give myself that permission? And do I feel safe enough within myself to acknowledge it? It was like a big like light bulb went off in my head. And I was like, yes, yes, and yes. And so I pushed myself to write this list, and then I had to email it to her. And I literally, when I tell you, I was like going back and forth for hours about hitting send, because it felt so strange to acknowledge all of the things that I felt good about me.
Mm.
And I did it, and I sent it to her, and she was like, we can add more.
Of course.
And I was like, okay, sure. And, you continue to work on it. And I remember I go back to that list, or I go back to that memory quite often, especially in moments where I feel like I'm putting myself, in a new situation. I'm extending my comfort zone. But it's just such an interesting phenomenon, like recognizing and remembering that you are safe enough to acknowledge yourself. And granted, I think that's a privilege. I think not everyone has that privilege, especially given your upbringing or your experience. But I just have felt that that's been so important too, to recognize like, hey, you can acknowledge who you are and feel good about it.
Psychological safety is not just about your relationship with your environment. It's about your relationship with yourself.
Can we just like drop the mic on that? Like that?
Yeah.
Oh, that is so good. I think too, part of this this has just been such a wonderful conversation so far about rest and boundaries and developing trust with yourself. But I think too, we often don't feel like we deserve that element of self-care. Like, especially when we are just viewing ourselves as workhorses and one dimensional, and I'm just here to show up and do my job and do the best I can. I think we forget like we're holistic beings and there's more to us than just our output. And so some of us, I think, really struggle with knowing that we deserve rest. I'm curious, either with your work or what you've shared on social media or in your own experience, do you have any advice or tips for anyone who's willing or ready to shift that perspective for themselves from I don't deserve it to it's actually not something I have to deserve. It's innate. Like it's part of my life to give myself that rest and that level of self-care.
My first tip would be to start saying no and say it regularly.
Ooh, yes. I like
Start saying no. This is, and I'm speaking from direct experience here because, I'm aware that I don't always practice what I preach. And, I say this to my partner all the time, I'm really good at giving advice. Am I great at listening to my own advice? Sure, he's out on that one. I'm working hard. I'm working hard to make sure that I can really hear myself, because sometimes I say things I'm like, wow, that sounded super smart. Who said that? And then it was me. So I'm validating that, there are moments where I have this knowledge, but I don't do it. And so the same thing will happen to people, right? Like, be gentle with yourselves. Allow yourself to make mistakes. And, the moment you start becoming intolerant of energy vampires, whether that be, people that want you to work longer or make meetings longer than they should be, people who step over your boundaries, places where you're not able to give yourself adequate and appropriate rest, because there's a difference between enough rest and the rest that you want. And so really giving yourself that time to get adequate rest, and then ultimately making the decision intentionally to be like, well, what is the kind of rest state that I want to be in? And allowing yourself to become more than just enough, because that is the transition from surviving to thriving and to blooming and to existing in this holistic space where you are beyond just a body or a piece of labor, a labor worker to do things for other people. And that includes the work that, you do for yourself. If you're an entrepreneur, you're not just your job, you're not just your business. You're a person. And so ultimately connecting to that higher sense of, is there more to me than just what I do? What would I like to be doing? What do I value? What matters to me? Do I feel regulated and safe enough to take the time to do these things that I love, to be with the people that I love? And if the answer is no, really start to give yourself time. And if you live by the calendar like me, schedule your rest breaks. Say no and schedule your rest breaks, and actually have time more consistently in your calendar that allows you to rest. And I think for people like me, where I live by the hour, my sessions are by the hour, my time is really like portioned out in this very discrete unit. And so when I can see on my calendar that, wow, I have the next 2 hours to just rest, and maybe I've scheduled in time to do work later, it really gives me a sense of peace and gratitude, not just for myself now to be able to lean into that, but for my past self and ultimately for my future self to be enough of a whole person that is rested and secure and confident, so that tomorrow isn't a bad day, so that the day after that is an even better one. And realizing that optimization isn't just about work output, but it's about expression of your identity. It's about authenticity. And so try not to put too many of the productivity metrics on what you do, and think about more about how you want to be and who you are.
Think about how you want to be and who you are. So much of your work in this conversation, I know it focuses on taking, I think, a holistic view of health and mental health. And so I'm curious, how do you define holistic, I guess is what I want to know from you. Do you focus on like mind, body, and soul? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I want to honor that so many of the healing practices that we
Mm-hmm.
engage in our Western model of medicine, right? Like I'm a
Yes.
regulated professional that speaks to a governing body that ultimately is regulated by a Western society.
Yeah.
A lot of these healing practices are indigenous in nature, and we didn't design
Mm-hmm.
them. We didn't
Mm-hmm.
create them. And so holistic psychological and psychotherapeutic and ways of existing is not just about mind, body, soul, but it's about mind, body, soul, and collectivism and
Mm.
community. And so thinking about not just from an individual perspective, but from a community perspective, a community care perspective as to how you want to exist in your world. Um, that's how I would define holistic. I think if you think about community, if you think about environment, if you think about what's going on inside your head, so
Mm-hmm.
mind,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about body, like the physiological sensations of what it means to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about your soul, like your emotions, your feelings, like your spirituality. All of that comes together in nature as it works off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
We notice that our mood is better when the sun is out. Why is that? you
Mm-hmm.
know
Mm-hmm.
we have
Mm-hmm.
so much connection when we're in groups of people that we feel safe with. Why is that? And it's no accident that our world is designed for us to exist in concert with each other. So for me, holistic healthcare and holistic support is about honoring the indigeneity of the work that we do, and really recognizing that what we do is something that is connected to something greater than us.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for that acknowledgement. I think that's incredibly important, and I'm so happy you said that. And I am really touched too by this sense of community and connection that you just spoke about. And what you said is that we are really meant to be in concert with one another. And I just keep thinking about the pandemic and the last year and how we really were missing that. Like we were missing that in its physical form. Sure, we could still be connected digitally, but we weren't able to be in concert, in connection with one another,
Mm-hmm.
in person. And I think that's where this need, at least I'm feeling, this greater need for rest and self care and nourishment is coming from at this point. Because over the last year, I think we've been so hyper focused on survival and so hyper focused on how can we maintain connection and how can we really maintain our sanity, to be perfectly honest. And so I think too, as things go back to whatever the new version of normal is going to be, and granted, wherever you are in the world, it's going to look different, the timeline is different, we're all on different ends of this spectrum. I think we're all trying to figure out how can we nurture ourselves while maintaining being in concert with one another.
Mm.
It's something I've been thinking a lot about, as you can probably tell. It's like, how do I continue to fill my cup, but also begin to connect with those around me in a way I haven't in the last
Mm-hmm.
year and a half?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a hard question within the pandemic
I
because
think so too.
so much of our ability to connect is not just on what we say, but it's also what we do,
Mm.
right? If I make a face that mirrors disgust, you will immediately have thoughts about what that might mean. And so expressions, nonverbals, gesticulations with your hands and engagement are all ways that we can start to utilize our body in more than just language.
Mm-hmm.
Language is a bit of a blunt tool, and we're not always as precise with it as we want to be. Sometimes we say things and our intention is misinterpreted, or our impact doesn't correlate with what we intended. And that can be really hard. And so digital communication makes those kinds of relational transgressions much more common
Yeah.
and more difficult to recover from. But ultimately realize that your relationship with yourself and nourishing yourself is a consistent and a necessary ritual it's not something that is dependent on your ability to connect with others. And to see those two as separate is going to be powerful, because then it's going to be less on how do I get this seesaw to even out, and more about like, okay, I'm going to focus on nourishing myself and engaging with lots of different types of ways of existing, whether that's creative, whether that's intellectual, whether that is more active, like body-based movement or engagement that replenishes my cup and makes me feel alive again, right? Gives you that vitality and that zestiness for life. But also thinking about, you know, who are the people in your life that make you feel zesty and alive and vital, and who honor your space, and who, you know, give you those reminders to get back out there into the world. You know, one of the things that I like to do is I think about whenever there's a new moon or like there's a full moon out, I kind of go out and I know that there's a couple other people looking at that moon. And that makes me feel awesome to know that, you know, I'm not the only one seeing this moon. And that's like a really silly thing that I've been doing for a long time. But I think our connection to our world, our connection to people is more than just what we can say and what we do. It's like our understanding of like, where can we find wisdom in our world, whether that's in nature, whether that's in you know, visual connection, like looking at the world, looking at our environment, or through our expression and through our way of communicating with each other in nonverbal ways. So, you know, everyone's going to have a different way of doing this, but ultimately feel empowered to be curious and engage with yourself and others in ways that you might not necessarily have planned to.
I wish I could write everything you just said down. So I'm gonna go back and write it down after we're done talking. Cause that was so beautiful. And I think too, you know, to tap into that wisdom that you were speaking about, we can do it really in a profound way for ourselves as we rest. So taking rest, allowing yourself quiet spaces, allowing yourself moments of reflection will allow you to look, I think, for that connection or see that connection in a different way or be able to tap into it. I keep reminding myself, and I've been reminding myself of this for at least 4 or 5 years. It's like you can do as much as you want and learn and connect, but then at some point you've got to give yourself enough time and space to integrate it and to process it. And for me, that's where those moments of rest come in for sure. So as we wrap up this conversation, and Meghan, thank you so much for this has been so good. I can't wait to share it. A couple of questions before we go. And these are questions I usually ask people at the end of our conversation. The first is, do you have a go-to quote, affirmation, mantra, something that you hold on to either as it pertains to rest and trust and boundaries, or just something you've carried with you throughout your life?
To quote the great Oprah,
Yes.
you cannot live a good life, a strong life, an engaged life without disappointing some people. Don't be afraid to let people down.
Oh, that is so good and so timely for this conversation. I love it.
It is.
I love
It
it.
is one of the things I pay attention to, and I remember all the time. You know, I'm like, well, she said it.
I mean, if Oprah is saying it and Oprah is doing it, then that is just all the permission I think we need.
Something's going right.
Something is going right over there.
It's from a conversation she had with Brene Brown a couple of years ago. And I think Brene was talking about, you know, well, how do I not let people down? Like, how do I not feel so at a loss when I am trying to live in my world? Something along those lines. And Oprah just simply said, you know, you can't live a life without disappointing people. So you heard it here first, second, third.
I love it. You know, I'm curious too, like as you have continued to allowed yourself to rest, and I think, you know, honor probably the burnout you've been experiencing. Have you started to feel or experience more joy? Have you found more joy in your life as you've, you know, embarked on this journey with rest with yourself?
I definitely have. I think, you know, ideally, I wouldn't just take a rest from posting on social media, but I will actually take rest, like put everything down, put on my out of office, and just take a few days or weeks, even a month maybe, to just exist in my body and not feel like I owe anyone my time or my energy. But I do find that periods of rest and consistent rest and being unapologetic about that rest and when I'm going to take it and why, and setting boundaries with people is much easier when you have a policy and you have an idea in mind of what you need. So don't be afraid. I know it can be easy to avoid the harsh truths of what it might mean to show up as ourselves, or to say no to someone, or to find that pocket of joy that you've been looking for. But ultimately, it's worth it. It's worth it to be who you need to be, because that's who I'm waiting for. Whoever's listening to this, I'm waiting for you to show up and be exactly who you are, so that we can be ourselves together. And that's joyful. That brings me joy.
I love it. It's worth it for you to be who you are meant to be, who you are. And then when we show up that way, we all show up that way. It's going to be huge. Okay. My last question for you before we go. And this is really the question I ask everybody that comes on the podcast. What is your biggest dream?
I thought about this and I found it so hard to answer. I was like, what is my biggest dream? And, if I'm being really, really honest with you, I'm living my dream. I am love, and I am my dreams. I am who I need to be, because I have the best job in the world. I frankly would not do anything else. I get to connect with people. I get to have conversations like this. I get to exist in a world where I talk meaningfully with other people, beyond the BS, underneath all of the stuff, and get to connect. And I just don't know if I would want to do anything else. But more tangibly, I dream for a unobstructed vacation. I feel like if I'm putting that out into the universe, I'm saying it here, it's going to come true.
It's coming true. It's going to come your way. I love it. Meghan, thank you for this incredible conversation. I'm so glad that we talked about rest and the reality of it, and why we struggle with it, and its role with boundaries and trust and feeling like you deserve your own self-care. So thank you for this conversation. Where can everybody find you and connect and learn more about everything you're doing, from Instagram to content creation to Bloom Psychology and Wellness? Where can everybody find you and connect and learn more?
Yeah. Well, you can connect with me on Instagram at thrive_with_Meg. I am usually posting, but maybe by the time you listen to this, I will be back. But I have lots and lots and lots of pieces of content for you to engage with and to learn about self-care and self-love. You can visit my website at watsonpsychotherapy.com. That's watson-psychotherapy.com. Or if you're in Ontario, Canada, and you're looking for therapy, you can visit my clinic website at bloompsychologyto.com, or catch us on IG at bloom_psychology.
Perfect. Everything's going to go in the show notes. We'll make it so easy for everyone to connect with you and learn more. And really, if you're not following Meghan on Instagram, do it, because the posts are so good. And they're always so timely for me, by the way. Maybe that's the intention. But
I've heard that before.
Really? They're always so timely. I'll be scrolling and I'll be like, it's like one of those I stop on and oh yeah, we're gonna save this. We're gonna screenshot it. We'll come back to it later. So amazing. Well, thank you. This has been so much fun. Thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Seek the Joy podcast is a production of Seek the Joy Media and created, produced, and hosted by me, Sydney Weiss. You can tune into all of our episodes on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're enjoying the show, hit follow and leave us a 5-star rating and review. Make sure to join the community, join the conversation on our social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We are at Seek the Joy Podcast everywhere. And don't forget, you can actually watch today's new episode and all of our episodes on our brand new YouTube channel. Click that link in the show notes to subscribe and tune in. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you right back here next week for another Seek the Joy Tuesday.